This little beggar girl reveals a secret at Millionaire's son's wake. But when the millionaire hears the secret, he immediately cries, "Comment. Giving my story a rating from 0 to 10, your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I count on your help." The scream ripped through the humid afternoon air like a blade, echoing through the cobblestone streets of the historic town at precisely 3 o'clock. The 52-year-old businessman nearly dropped his coffee cup as he turned away from the window of his luxury condo. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the clapboard house across the street, a faded yellow 2-story building with peeling blue window frames that clashed with the elegance of the modern building where he lived. "Must be a kid's tantrum," he muttered to himself, adjusting his tie before returning to work. As the owner of one of the largest construction firms in the region, he was accustomed to solving complex problems, but he preferred to stay away from other people's dramas, especially after 5 years of living alone. Ever since he lost his wife on a rainy night, he preferred not to remember. Across the street, inside the clapboard house, the 4-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the kitchen, unable to understand why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman firmly held a metal spoon that she had heated on the gas stove, her eyes red from the alcohol, fixed on the child trembling before her. "You're a curse on this house," the aunt hissed, her voice slurred from the booze she'd been consuming since noon at the Rusty Mug. "Because of you, my sister is gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her thin arms. The child bit her lip to keep from screaming any louder. She had learned that screams only enraged her aunt, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice, singing that lullaby before bed. It was all that remained of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful moments. "Stop your whining!" the aunt grunted, putting the spoon back in the drawer as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you mess up the walls again with that filthy charcoal, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's song softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that, across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The businessman stopped reviewing the contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it when she cooked, a folk song about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the clapboard house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that struck a chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. Next door to the clapboard house, the 61-year-old retired teacher was watering her begonias when she heard the girl singing. Unlike the businessman, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years teaching elementary school, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress, and that voice carried a pain that made her heart clench. How strange, she thought, observing the windows of the house next door, a family she had known for decades. The aunt had always been troubled, but since she took custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the air of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children in the historic town. The teacher dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since they had spoken properly, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little girl better. The businessman remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of his former employee who had abruptly resigned 5 years ago, a few months before the accident. The ex-employee was a gentle woman, always humming while organizing the construction company files. Then suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought of her again until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to be suffering in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains surrounding the historic town as the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers clutched the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the bird she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, the businessman closed the curtains and tried to return to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell over the historic town, but the echo of that childish song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running from his responsibilities and a retired teacher who had never been able to ignore the suffering of a child. Both unknowingly were about to become involved in a situation that would test their limits and transform their lives in ways they never imagined. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical bustle of the town awakening for another day. The teacher put on her best floral dress and carefully combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the clapboard house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The aunt opened the door with a puffy face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning," the teacher said, with her most gentle smile. "I came to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've had a proper conversation." The aunt hesitated, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, Mrs. Davison, it's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The teacher took a step forward, forcing the aunt to step back. "And I would very much like to meet your niece. I heard she's a lovely girl." The aunt's face hardened for an instant before forcing a weak smile. "The girl is. She's sick, high fever, better not get close." At that moment a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Perhaps I can help," the teacher insisted. "I have experience with sick children. I raised 3 kids, you know how it is." "No need, no need," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just the flu. It will pass soon." The teacher noticed the aunt's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol that emanated from her even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades of dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene from his window while he ate breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confusing dreams, where a child's voice mingled with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the clapboard house, a strange curiosity washed over him. The teacher finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not before casting an inquisitive look into the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. Inside the clapboard house, the aunt locked the door forcefully and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouching behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" the aunt growled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty," the girl murmured, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the yard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single mango tree. There she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the stove. It was always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house, where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the girl in the yard under the hot midday sun. The child began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to sing her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was that melody that reached the businessman's ears again. This time, he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar about that voice, that specific song. He grabbed his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him he might need that evidence. While he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. The ex-employee used to hum that same song while she worked. She, who had been an exemplary employee until she disappeared abruptly. She, who always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl named... "Her daughter," the businessman murmured, his cell phone trembling in his hands. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the gentle woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made this connection before? The businessman put away his cell phone and began to pace back and forth in his condo. He vaguely remembered the ex-employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems in the company, that he hadn't paid proper attention. Now, 5 years later, her daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt he carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including regret for not having helped when she clearly needed it. At 3 o'clock precisely, the screams started again. This time, the businessman didn't turn away from the window. He watched with growing horror as through the kitchen window of the clapboard house he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He grabbed his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and she was gesturing violently towards a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the businessman couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with this information? That night, the girl slept on the floor of the yard, where the aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the mango tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her out of that place of pain. Across the street, the businessman couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's departure. 3 days had passed since the businessman discovered the child's identity, and guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During those days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering a few feet from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in the clapboard house next door. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting a new direct visit to the aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from which she had the best view of the backyard of the clapboard house. What she saw horrified her. The girl was sitting under the mango tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing on the ground with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "My God," the teacher whispered, her hands trembling as she held the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined, much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to Mrs. Davison's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," the girl said in her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, honey," Mrs. Davison replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you all right?" The girl glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm okay. Just drawing birdies." "That's nice. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," the child replied, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke Mrs. Davison's heart. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Girl, where are you?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything Mrs. Davison needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the educator with an expression that screamed for help. Mrs. Davison remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend she didn't know what was happening. Across the street, the businessman had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could see the neighboring yard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him nauseous. For the first time in 5 years, he felt genuine fury burning in his chest. The ex-employee had trusted him in some way, even if indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time. She had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable condo, paralyzed by his own cowardice. At 11 in the morning, Mrs. Davison made a courageous decision. She put on her best business casual attire, grabbed a tray of homemade cookies she had prepared as a pretext, and headed back to the clapboard house. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by her neighbor's insistence. "Mrs. Davison, I already told you it's not a good time." "Dear, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," the educator interrupted firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little one better. As old neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, Mrs. Davison had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom experience had given her. The interior of the clapboard house was dark and smelled of mildew mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the living room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," the aunt lied, blocking the way to the back of the house. "What a pity. Maybe another time then," Mrs. Davison said, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the gas stove, and especially small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. Mrs. Davison and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "Must be the neighbor's cat," the aunt said quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. Mrs. Davison smiled and nodded, but had decided she had seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always here next door if you need anything. Anything at all." The educator's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After Mrs. Davison left, the aunt locked the door forcefully and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl curled up behind the gas stove, trying to hide. The child had cried when she heard Mrs. Davison's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," the aunt accused, her eyes already shining with familiar fury. "No, aunt, I didn't make noise," the girl protested, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The aunt picked up the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. The girl recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to attract attention, don't you?" the aunt hissed as the spoon heated up. "You want the neighbors to come here asking questions? You think I can't take care of you?" Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone on the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. The ex-employee had been a good person, a dedicated employee who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. While the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the businessman made a call he hadn't made in months. He called his personal attorney and old college friend, Mr. Peterson. "I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching from the window as the girl's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it may be a matter of life and death." That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room sofa, the girl managed to quietly slip out into the yard. Her new burns stung, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the mango tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's song softly. What she didn't know was that, for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering. And that, in the coming days, her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. Mr. Peterson arrived at the businessman's condo on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been classmates in college almost 3 decades ago, and Mr. Peterson knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the previous night had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," Mr. Peterson said, sitting down in the spacious living room of the condo. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." The businessman poured coffee and positioned himself near the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being abused by the aunt who cares for her." "Abused how, Mr. Peterson asked, taking a notepad from his briefcase. "Burns, daily screams, neglect." The businessman paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, evidence of what's happening." Mr. Peterson was silent for a moment, processing the information. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact the authorities immediately." "I know," the businessman replied, running his hands over his face. "But there's something else. The ex-employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before the accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible," Mr. Peterson completed, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded. If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have had to leave her daughter with that woman. At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and Mr. Peterson could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "This happens every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 o'clock religiously, but sometimes also at other times," the businessman replied, picking up his cell phone. "Want to see the recordings?" Mr. Peterson watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a lawyer specializing in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse. But something in the systematization of that violence disturbed him deeply. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the District Attorney's Office. This child needs to be removed from that house immediately." While the two men planned the intervention, across the street, the girl was living another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the girl had made on the kitchen wall during the early morning. "How many times do I have to tell you not to mess up the walls?" the aunt screamed, grabbing the girl's arm hard enough to leave marks. "You're a plague, a curse on this house." The girl tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. "You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you," the aunt continued, pushing the child down the hall. "And if I hear even a noise, you'll know a punishment you've never experienced before." The room where the girl was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to sing her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort, in a world that seemed to have forgotten she existed. It was that song that Mrs. Davison heard when she passed by the house on her way to the grocery store. The educator had spent the whole night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard, the marks she had seen on the child's arms, the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. Mrs. Davison stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but filled with a sadness that made the educator's heart break. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the grocery store, Mrs. Davison headed directly to the downtown area, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew the caseworker well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. "I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," Mrs. Davison said, entering the office without ceremony. The caseworker looked up from the papers she was analyzing. "Mrs. Davison, good to see you. What brings you here today?" "A child in danger. My neighbor. I'm sure she's being abused." The caseworker straightened up in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years as a caseworker, she had learned to recognize when a report was serious, and Mrs. Davison was not the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," the caseworker said, grabbing a complaint form. While Mrs. Davison related her observations, across town, Mr. Peterson was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. The prosecutor listened attentively as Mr. Peterson presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "This is compelling evidence," the prosecutor said, examining the videos on Mr. Peterson's cell phone. "I will order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will that take?" Mr. Peterson asked, concerned. "With this evidence, we can act today," the prosecutor replied. "I'm going to contact Child Protective Services now." It was thus that, by a coincidence that would change the girl's fate, 2 simultaneous reports arrived at Child Protective Services on the same morning. The caseworker was finishing noting Mrs. Davison's report when her phone rang. Child Protective Services. This is Sarah speaking. This is ADA Miller. I need you to make an urgent intervention at a house. We have evidence of severe child abuse. The caseworker paused, the pen suspended over the paper. Is it the yellow clapboard house by any chance? Exactly. How did you know? I just received a report about the same house, the caseworker replied, looking at Mrs. Davison with surprise. 2 independent sources. This confirms the seriousness of the situation. At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. The caseworker, accompanied by 2 social workers and a court officer, was heading to the house. Mrs. Davison had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The businessman watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. Mr. Peterson was at his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. "You did the right thing," Mr. Peterson said, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," the businessman replied, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the Clapboard house. In the house, the aunt had gone out to buy alcohol, leaving the girl locked in the stuffy room. The child continued singing softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When the caseworker knocked on the door of the Clapboard house and received no response, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in every room. It was Mrs. Davison who first heard the weak voice coming from the room in the back. "There's someone here," she said, guiding the team down the hall. When they opened the door to the room and found the girl curled up in the corner singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child raised her big, frightened eyes, not understanding who those people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, honey," the caseworker said, crouching down to be at the child's height. "My name is Sarah. We've come to help you." The girl looked at Mrs. Davison, recognizing the kind lady who had talked to her in the yard. A flicker of hope shone in her eyes, but was quickly replaced by fear. "Aunt is going to be mad," she whispered. "You don't have to worry about that now," Mrs. Davison said, extending her hand to the child. "Let's get out of here, okay?" And so, after 8 months of silent suffering, the girl was finally removed from the house where she had known only pain and fear. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene with tears in his eyes, finally allowing himself to feel something beyond the guilt that had paralyzed him for so long. He didn't know it yet, but that would be just the beginning of a journey that would transform not only that child's life, but also his own, in ways he never imagined possible. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.